In 1995, the median American renter spent about 24% of their income on housing. Today, in many cities, it's over 35%. In some, it crosses 50%. That's not luxury rent, that's basic shelter. A one-bedroom, 40 minutes from downtown, no skyline view, no amenities worth mentioning. And still, the numbers don't work. Wages moved, inflation happened, construction continued, but rent kept outpacing all of it. Faster than salaries, faster than savings, faster than stability. You can feel it in the small decisions. The roommate you didn't want, the move you postponed, the family you delayed. Housing used to be a milestone. Now it feels like a subscription. So what changed? Why did rent stop behaving like a price and start behaving like a pressure system? Supply and demand is the easy answer. But that still doesn't explain the pattern. Because the shift wasn't sudden. It was structural. And once it locked in, it didn't need a crisis to keep rising. It just needed time. So here's the question that doesn't go away. When did renting stop being a temporary stage and become a permanent position inside the system? The obvious story is simple. More people moved to cities. Zoning restricted new construction. Land became scarce. Demand rose faster than supply. Prices followed. That explanation makes sense. Urban cores are finite. Permits take time. Neighborhoods resist density. And yes, in many markets, not enough housing was built. Developers focused on higher-end units. Older buildings aged out. Entry-level supply tightened. So rent climbed. That explains the moment, not the pattern. Because the pattern shows something different. Rent didn't just rise in superstar cities. It climbed in mid-sized metros, in suburbs, even in places with flat population growth. Here's where the pattern changes. The share of single-family homes owned by institutions began to rise. Large portfolios formed, not in Manhattan, in Phoenix, in Atlanta, in Tampa, quietly. Most people still imagined landlords as individuals, a couple, a retiree, someone renting out a duplex, but increasingly, the owner was a fund, a balance sheet, a yield target. That explains the transaction, not the system. Because once housing becomes an asset class, the logic shifts, and the incentives shift with it. Which raises a harder question. If rent isn't just about shelter demand anymore, what is it really responding to? Zoom out. After the 2008 housing collapse, something subtle happened. Foreclosures spiked, home prices fell, credit tightened for individuals, but capital did not disappear. It reassembled. Private equity firms began buying single-family homes at scale, not dozens, thousands. Entire subdivisions in places like Phoenix and Las Vegas were absorbed into portfolios. The pitch was simple. Homes were cheap. Rents were stable. Yields looked predictable. But here's the pivot. For decades, single-family homes were mostly owned by occupants. After 2008, they became acquisition targets, not for living, for holding. The question from earlier returns in a new form: when did renting stop being temporary and start becoming a position in someone else's portfolio strategy? It wasn't a cultural shift. It was a capital shift. Money that once flowed into bonds looked elsewhere. Interest rates fell to historic lows. Institutional investors searched for yield. Homes, once local and personal, became scalable. Algorithms optimized pricing. Data systems mapped tenant behavior. Rent wasn't set by a landlord down the street. It was calibrated. Across markets, across regions, across entire portfolios. But here's the part most people miss. It wasn't greed. It was structure. When rates are near zero, capital moves toward assets that produce cash flow. Housing produces cash flow. It wasn't that cities became unaffordable. It was that homes became financial instruments. And once housing entered that arena, it stopped competing only with other apartments. It started competing with bonds, with equities, with alternative assets. Abstraction can hide the human layer, so bring it back down. Imagine a thermostat in a building. It doesn't care who's inside, it only reads targets. Now imagine rent tied not just to local wages, but to return expectations set in New York boardrooms. When yield targets rise, pricing pressure follows. Not because a landlord feels like raising rent, but because a portfolio must perform. That's the expansion. And it sets up the mechanism. Because once housing is financialized, stability means something different. It doesn't mean affordable, it means dependable. And systems protect dependability. Here's the mechanism. Start at the surface. An institutional owner acquires thousands of homes. They finance part of it with debt. That debt has a cost. The portfolio has investors. Those investors expect returns. So rent is no longer just covering maintenance and taxes. It is servicing capital. That's layer one. Now the reinforcing loop. If rents rise across the portfolio, the asset value increases. Higher asset values improve the balance sheet. A stronger balance sheet allows refinancing. Refinancing releases more capital. More capital acquires more homes. Scale improves pricing power. Pricing power stabilizes yield. And stabilized yield attracts more capital. It becomes self-reinforcing, not because someone declared it so, but because incentives align that way. If housing is treated as an income-generating asset, then protecting income becomes central. If protecting income supports valuation, and valuation supports borrowing capacity, then stabilizing rent growth supports the entire structure. If X depends on Y and Y depends on Z, then stabilizing Z requires protecting X. Rent supports valuation. Valuation supports leverage. Leverage supports expansion, so rent becomes structural. Not emotional, not arbitrary, structural. Earlier, we hinted at it. Now it becomes clear. The system didn't make housing scarce. It made rental income sensitive to capital markets. When interest rates shift, return thresholds shift. When return thresholds shift, pricing strategies adjust. That's the preview delivered. This is not about villains. It's about transmission. Capital markets send signals. Portfolios respond. Tenants absorb. Rent didn't just rise because demand increased. It rose because housing became collateral. And once rent is tied to collateral value, flat rents are not neutral. Flat rents weaken projections. Weakened projections compress valuations. Compressed valuations restrict borrowing. Restricted borrowing slows acquisition. So stability, from the system's perspective, means upward pressure, not explosive, just persistent. It doesn't need a crisis. It just needs expectations to remain intact. That's the inevitability. And once locked in, the shift sustains itself. At the beginning, the question was simple. When did renting stop being temporary and become a permanent position inside the system? The answer isn't a date, it's a redefinition. Housing moved from being primarily shelter to being infrastructure for capital. In Act 1, rent looked like a monthly bill. In Act 3, it looked like yield. In Act 4, it revealed itself as collateral. Now step back. If rent supports asset value and asset value supports leverage, then renters are not just occupants. They are revenue streams inside a financial architecture. That doesn't mean every landlord is institutional. It means the price-setting gravity shifted. Even small owners operate inside markets shaped by capital flows. When the benchmark moves, everyone feels it. The original tension wasn't about greed. It was about structure. Rent didn't start rising because people wanted more space. It kept rising because the system required predictability. And predictability, in finance, prefers growth over flat lines. So the renter's experience changes. Not dramatically, incrementally, lease by lease, increase by increase, until the temporary stage becomes long-term exposure. Here's the reframed question. If rent is now a stabilizer for balance sheets, what would it take for affordability to become the stabilizer instead? Because the system, as designed, protects cash flow before comfort. No one planned a rent crisis. But once housing became collateral, higher rents became rational. That's the gravity. And gravity doesn't argue, it just pulls.